Well, good morning for most of you, and welcome to our webinar on the pay gap, where we look at the international dimension. We have many speakers from different countries and are curious to learn how we can learn from each other. And to kick off the discussion, my colleague Monika Queisser will give us a short intro about OECD analysis and policy advice on the matter. Monika, the floor is yours. We're very curious to learn what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Nicola, and a big welcome from my side of the OECD here in Paris as well. We're delighted to present a couple of insights from recent work, because this area of pay gaps, gender pay gaps, is a very important area of work for the OECD, particularly which in a grouping that many of you may know. We also have the Equal Pay International Coalition, where we work together with UN Women and ILO to combat gender pay gaps across the world. So let me start on my first slide, just to give you a little bit of information on recent work that we've been doing. These are our latest relevant reports for this topic. One we brought out in spring this year, which is called Gender Equality in a Changing World. It shows data collection, policy mapping on gender equality outcomes and policies. This is a report that was done together in a cooperation and for the European Commission, for DG Justice, because they are involved in working out a new gender strategy for the EU. So this is our contribution to the elaboration of this new strategy. And you will find lots of different areas in there. And what is perhaps new about this report is that we've been looking at policy packages. So we've built matrices to look at how different policy areas can best fit together, and how we can make sure that things are complementary rather than contradictory, and how to get the biggest bang for your buck that you invest in different policy areas. And then a very recent publication, which we just released end of November, is Pensions at a Glance. Some of you might know this publication. We release this every 2 years, and it looks at pensions across the OECD and G20 countries. And every time it has a special chapter diving deep into one specific issue. And this time it is a chapter on the gender pension gap and the determinants of the gap. So if you're interested in knowing how wage gaps evolve and to what results they lead over the life cycle, then do take a look at all of these reports. And I should also say, for those of you who might have been frustrated in the past, the OECD now is completely open source. So all of these reports are now available and downloadable on our website without any problems or costs involved. If we move now to the next slide, we can take a little look at gender wage gaps. And this is just for a few countries. You can see the OECD average is here in red. And then we have a few European countries, but also New Zealand and the United States, Japan, that show you how wage gaps gender wage gaps have been evolving. So the good news is it's been going down, because you can see on the left-hand side in the year 2000, it was much higher in many countries. But the bad news is it's been going down very slowly. So we still have a woman working full-time, earning only 89 cents for every dollar that a man earns. So that's about 11%. That's 8 cents better than in 1995, but still it could go faster. I think we would all agree. Now, we've, of course, at the OECD also been looking at the determinants of these gender wage gaps. And there's a bunch of different factors that we know about. So none of this will be a big surprise to you, but it's still worth listing them. So compared to men, women have lower employment rates in many countries, and they're more likely to work part-time. They spend fewer hours in paid work, particularly if they have children, and they spend more hours in unpaid work. And you can, we've done some other analysis for Germany in the past, and you can see it's quite dramatic when children arrive, how the gap goes up in terms of more paid work for men and more unpaid work for women, even in situations where before the arrival of children, it was fairly balanced. So we clearly see that there's a relationship between having a family and then reducing your paid hours and work as a woman and increasing unpaid work. Now, of course, we know that all of this negatively affects earnings, career prospects, and social protection entitlements, in particular pensions. And we also know, and this is a little bit harder to measure and even harder, I think, to change, is that gender norms and stereotypes are really important in this area. So there's still in some countries a perception that children are best off with their biological mothers taking care of them, that it's not a good idea to use nannies, to put them into childcare early. And then even in some countries, there is still also an idea that mothers do a better job than fathers, which is, I think, quite sad for fathers when you come to think about it. And so there's many stereotypes that we still that many societies are still up against in order to make this a more equitable world, and in particular of work for women. And I think what we're also observing, and this is maybe something we can discuss later, that there is some pushback lately, and while the tradwife movement that many hear about maybe is more limited than you might think, maybe something more that's advertised a lot on social media, there is much more polarization between men and women, and we will see how this evolves in the future. Now, but it doesn't mean that governments can do nothing about this. There's many things they can do. So we know that distribution of family leave is important, good quality childcare, and then we also know that there's reforms that can be done in tax benefit systems to make it easier or a better situation for second earners, which in some countries are still disadvantaged. Now, if we move to the next slide, you can see, and again, I think most people are quite aware of this, that women are overrepresented in caregiving jobs. And here's just one number. You have all of the graph shows you all of the countries. But first of all, you see the main statistic here is 87% of LTC workers, long-term care workers, are women on average in OECD countries. And we know that this is a really important area because all of our countries in the OECD are facing population aging. And this is one area where we know that labor market pressures will be evolving. And according to our calculation, aging will increase the demand for long-term care workers by 22%. It's a lot, 22% by 2033. And already we have almost 9 out of 10 LTC workers being women. And it's similar also in early childhood education and care. So in order to meet rising needs in LTC, it's important to bring more men in. That's very clear. And how can we do that? We need to improve the quality and pay of jobs for everybody, not only to bring men in, but to have women. And we have to work on desegregating these fields of work. So we need LTC in order to have the carers we need for aging populations. We simply need to make this a more attractive proposition for people to come in. And despite high demand, and this is an area, if you like, it's puzzling because we know the demand is high and increasing, but still wages haven't really been following. The LTC jobs are notoriously low paid and low quality. On average, people who work in this sector earn 20% less than the economy-wide average wage. So we need to do something about this with smarter government interventions and also public-private collaboration on pay. And let me just say one thing, and since we're doing this with our Berlin office, you could easily say all we need to do is increase wages, which is what Germany, for example, has been doing, for example, by home carers requiring their night hours to be paid as well. This is great for carers, but it has put families in a difficult position because this is largely paid by families. So while we all agree there has to be better pay, more hours paid, the families who've been shouldering this burden simply sometimes cannot do this and then revert to making family care the alternative. So it's tricky, and we really need to find better ways how to distribute this burden of cost so that we can't just leave it with families. And we need more government interventions here. Then we need to improve job quality and working conditions, which will require action on multiple fronts, like ensuring reasonable hours, reducing heavy workloads, using assistive technologies. So new technologies, robotics, and so might be something we can use in the future. And we also need to expand training and prevention. And we need to really make the sector more inclusive, and we also need to create safe legal pathways for migrant care workers who is increasingly essential to meet future needs. And there was a very interesting Instagram campaign by German care staff that showed what would happen to their sector if there were no more migrants. And you could see that the numbers would be so vastly reduced that it would be impossible to do this caring work already today, without the many migrants who are active in this sector. Another point, and again, this is something we've been talking about for a long time. On the next slide, you will see the representation of women in tech. So this is something, again, we've been working a lot for a long time. And we see that the share of employed men and women in ICT task intensive jobs is much higher for men, 16%, and only 12% for women. Again, it's getting better, but we have to do more. And now with AI coming, I think this is particularly important, and we really have to pay more attention to this, because I remember that in the past we were saying girls need to learn how to code, for example. Yes, that's still important, but a lot of coding will be done by AI in the future. So we have to be very careful how we structure the promotion of women in these jobs, and make sure that we don't put them into jobs which are, again, jobs that are at high risk of replacement by artificial intelligence. And so if we then move to the next one, we have a little overview and of where the different feminized sectors are and how they pay. What is the relationship between pay and feminization of sectors? And what you see here is the estimated hourly wages relative to the average wage. So always to see how much it pays in terms of average wage, and the gender balance in different sectors. And we did research on 16 OECD countries, and we found actually that a lot of the gender wage gap comes from within firms, but there's still a sizable portion that comes from sectors. And we can see in this figure, and let me just explain this a little bit, but of course you will have the slides later to also take a closer look at it and ask us any questions following the seminar. So women, what you see in this figure is that women tend to work more often in sectors that pay lower wages for individuals with similar work characteristics. Most dots on the right side, which are occupations with many women. So on the right side are occupations with many women. You can see hospitals, residential nursing care, LTC, and home-based LTC. So you can see those big dots here on the right-hand side are all related to long-term care. They lie below the horizontal midpoint, which means that they're paid less. And the downward trend line shows that there's a clear negative relationship. As the share of women in an occupation increases, median earnings tend to fall. So the more women you have, the lower the wages are. And this shows, for us, it's the structural undervaluation of female-dominated work, and it highlights how occupational segregation contributes to gender pay gaps. And when you have larger bubbles, you can see that those represent sectors employing more workers. So you can see there's quite a few bigger bubbles here, and so it shows that we do have many major parts of the labor market represent or affected by gender pay gaps. Yeah, so I think I'll stop with the numbers. There's more to say about this, but maybe we can return to that later if you're interested. So then we have also looked, and this was in the context, and the next slide you can see lifetime earnings. We looked at how in most OECD countries pensions are a combination of lifetime or based on lifetime earnings. And so we looked at the conjunction of expected career duration, working hours, and hourly wages, and looked how these contribute to gender gaps in expected lifetime earnings. And we saw that these three areas pretty much contribute to gender gaps in lifetime earnings at same measure. So women are less in the labor market. So they work fewer years because they take time out for care, both childcare and elderly care. When they do work, they work fewer hours. And for these fewer hours, they get lower wages. So no surprise, there's massive gaps in lifetime earnings between men and women. And these then, of course, translate into gender pension gaps. And so, like I said, each of these factors contributes about 1/3. And we often get asked at the OECD how it can be, what is the perfect pension system to make these gender pension gaps go away, or at least make them very small. And unfortunately, the bad news is there is no such system that makes it go away, because it really happens throughout the career, over the whole lifetime. And once you arrive at pensions, no pension system is good enough to basically make up for all of these inequalities that accumulate over the years. Now, what can countries do? There's plenty of things that can be done, which we have summarized a little bit on the next slide. One of the things, remember, I showed you the segregation, both women in LTC and no women in ICT jobs. And the career expectations mirror occupational segregation in the labor market. This is quite interesting. It comes from our PISA work. This is the share of 15-year-old girls reporting career expectations for selected occupations. And it shows then, with the little diamonds, how many women are in these sectors. And you can see that the highest expectation of 15-year-old is they want to be health associate professionals, teaching, health professionals, clerical support workers, service and sales workers, then legal, social, and cultural professions. So those are just the first 6 of them. And and then you can see that at the bottom, you can see science and engineering associate professionals, that they really don't want to do that much. About 20% only say that this is their career aspiration. Plant and machine operators, protective services workers, craft and related trades workers. So basically those are and you can see that at the bottom that in some cases there's even fewer women in those sectors that are more technical than the girls said that they wanted. So we really need to start working early on those stereotypes, and this is a myriad of different things in education systems, textbooks, and we also mentorships, and just telling girls also that these are actually strong, they have strong chances in these sectors, even if they don't come to mind immediately, and they don't all have to be math geniuses to be working in those sectors. And I think that's something that's really very important. And maybe that's also something we always hear, is that at job fairs, girls are looking for something that they can relate to in terms of occupations, and boys ask, how much am I going to be paid in these occupations? And so I think girls, while it's good to be wanting a job that speaks to you, that is related to your passions and you feel good about, you should also be very clear about earnings potentials in the different sectors, which might also influence people's choices, young people's choices. And then we've also done, and this is my last slide, policy. We've done work on policy measures. This is, of course, a very important area of work. There is, particularly in Europe, where there is a pay transparency directive that needs to be transposed into and implemented in member countries. And one of the areas that are really interesting here is that now half of the OECD countries require or recommend gender-neutral job evaluation systems. So these are systems to compare the value of work based on objective gender-neutral criteria in the private sector. And if we can apply those systems well and have good measurements, then we could go quite a way in having more equal wages, because you would really try and see what are the contributions of each of these sectors. And then probably long-term care, because it's so important to us and it's such an essential part for society, particularly aging societies, will come out much more valuable to society than people would say, just based on maybe the number of years you have to study in order to do such jobs. So just over 1/3 of the OECD countries already require or recommend such systems, and they're quite different in application. We have a lot of literature about this, and I would again recommend looking at our reports. And we also have a series of webinars on pay transparency, which are also available on our website, which you can take a look over, for example, at the end of your holidays if you have some time. And so this is an area which we're very happy to assist countries in implementing as well. So with that, my last slide, you just see an overview of a few of our reports. And now I will stop talking and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Monika, for introducing us into the subject. And now I'm very excited to ask my panel on the screen, because they're from so many different countries and also different angles of looking into the subject. So I welcome Cristina Castellanos Serrano. She's a researcher from Spain, from the Universidad Nacional de Educación Distancia, and based in Madrid, I think. Very welcome, Cristina. I have Iga Magda, who's from the Warsaw School of Economics and also the Institute of Structural Research, a long-term collaborator and friend, and very knowledgeable about many aspects of labor market issues. Hello, Iga. Great that
Hello.
I have Lina Zala, I hope I pronounced this right, Zalanauskaite from Lithuania, the European Institute for Gender Equality. And it's great to have you here. Hello. And finally, Chantal Stratford, who's joining us from Canberra in Australia. So that's great that you're still up. I wonder how late it is in Australia for you, Chantal.
It's only 8 o'clock or 8:30 in the evening.
Well, you're
quite civilized.
working overtime for us. So that's great. It's good to have you. Yeah. And perhaps and Monika, of course, will discuss with us. I think I want to start with you, Lina, because this one graph about lifetime earnings, I found that very striking. So it looks as though the gender pension gap is perhaps small in Lithuania because all these dimensions, the dimensions career duration and hours worked, the difference to men on average were small. But what I did notice is that in comparison to the other countries that we have around the screen, so Spain, Australia, and Poland, the pay gap, the hourly pay gap was still quite high. So I'm wondering, when you look into this, can you explain why, despite these, let's say, aspects that could make for lower hourly pay, that you have a shorter career, that you work fewer hours, so maybe you're not promoted like somebody who works full-time all the time, there's still this pay gap. What explains it in your mind?
Yes, thank you, Nicola. I'm really happy to jump on this one. So we are based in Lithuania, but as a European Institute, we actually do lots of comparisons across the countries. And I think you asked me my favorite question, what makes this difference? So the graph you showed, it's about the lifetime earnings. And we used to always say in lots of our reports and the recommendations to the European Union and countries, that actually gender pay gap is a very small measure. It has to be complemented by this kind of a bit bigger measure. So you looked into the lifetime earnings. So we use the total overall earnings. It's a synthetic indicator, also used to be produced by Eurostat. But essentially what really matters is not just the difference in the pay gap in terms of the 1 hour that we would observe, some average hour between women and men, but actually their overall participation in the labor market. So you rightly pointed out, for example, Lithuania, we have what we had there in this 3 components is, yes, because of the Soviet legacy, women and men participate more on equal basis in the labor market. However, there is a huge gender segregation still, and there is especially in vertical segregation, not only horizontal segregation, and also now increasingly also the number of hours. So it's a bit of the post-still Soviet country legacy that influenced the labor market here. But on the other side of your graph, what you have showed there, it was also Malta, Italy, Romania, for example. And these countries are typically known to have relatively small gender pay gap, but it would be a huge pension gap and huge difference in lifetime earnings. And this is where the fact is that it's only a small share of women who participate in the labor market. So those essentially what we're comparing higher qualified women with, let's say, overall mass of men who are in the labor market because men are expected to earn. And so our gender pay gap typically per hour shrinks, but if we would look into the lifetime earnings, is huge, because of course the number of working hours, the segregation that comes along it, it's massive. And these are the factors that influence the major lifetime difference in earnings, in economic independence, and of course that turns into the pension gap later on. Yeah, so country differences are huge and depends a lot on the labor market structures, but it's rooted in the gender inequality in lots of various structural reasons, very often related to care, of course. Yes.
Yeah, and we'll come back to those policy measures or aspects later. But since you just talked, so very important point, sometimes the wage gap appears small, but you have to look at the labor force participation at the same time, because you're comparing a different set of women and men in some ways. Iga, Poland, I also looked at Poland when I looked at the graph, and well, Poland doesn't have a Soviet legacy, but a communist legacy, but still the career duration is a lot shorter on average, it seems, than in Lithuania. So it seems that perhaps it's due to, I don't know, is daycare not as well developed as in neighboring Baltic countries, for example. So where does that come from, and how has it developed? Perhaps how are things developing for, well, labor force participation and also earnings gaps between men and women in Poland?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you said, there are so many factors that are behind the gender pay gap that it's really difficult to single out which are the most important. If we look at labor force participation of women, it's actually doing quite well. And just looking at the recent graphs of employment of women, and also including, or even mostly including mothers, we can see that the gap has really, compared to men, has really decreased over the past 15 years. So that's a very nice change. We also must take into account that women are so much better educated than men in Poland. I mean, it concerns all the countries, but the gap in Poland is really striking. And it also means that the average pay gap that we observe doesn't really shows just a blurred picture. And if we take into account the education and the occupational segregation, it turns out that the adjusted pay gap, so this unexplained component, is really high, so much higher than the average gap. So that's really, from economic perspective, it's really important to talk about this adjusted pay gap as well. If I may, I would also like to jump on some of the questions that were raised in the publication, in the presentation. It was very interesting. Men and gender, I mean, gender norms. It's really a growing topic in a lot of research on the factors behind wage inequality of men and women. But one of the things that is really striking for us is that if we look at different projects that are more qualitative in nature, we can see that it's really men who are suffering from gender norms, in the sense that many of them would really like to participate in the childcare and be involved, and actually it's the workplace that is very usually discouraging for them, and it's really a stigma that they very often face associated with trying to take 2 weeks or oh my god, 6 months of paid parental leave, and which doesn't cost a cent to the employer. So from economic perspective, it's like a win-and-win situation. Yes, from the Polish perspective, it's also the public sector that matters, in the sense that it's still a large share of employment in total economy is in the public sector, and the public sector has a pay gap which is twice lower than the private one. So that's like contributing to the average pay gap that we observe at the country level, and I think that's a message that says that if you have regulation of wages, if you have pay regulations that are in place, you can really have more equal wages in the public sector compared to the private one. And the very last point I wanted to touch upon is this great graph that you showed on the occupational choices of girls and the structure of employment and the segregation. So actually, we did a study on graduates in Poland, looking at the different sectoral participation and the STEM subjects in particular. And we show that even at the very entry level, after graduation, when women and men who have studied the same direction, the same majors, they enter the labor market, women already earn 10-12% less than men, which is probably due to negotiations and issues like that. But it's a huge gap already at the very, very beginning among educated, well-educated young people. So I think that's yeah.
So some things, so many aspects, Iga, and we will have to come back to some of them later. But that's fascinating. That that perhaps men would like to do more parental care, but it's not happening. But then also the aspects of negotiations that with the same kind of training, you earn differently. That's something we have to explore more. But let me go around not the table, but the screen. And before I bring in another third European countries, I do want to ask you, Chantal. So you're advising governments, I think, in the Asia Pacific. So perhaps you can tell us about Australia, but also some other countries. So because it's interesting to look at these country differences. Can you say, is it possible to say that there are some things that work uniformly in some ways, or does it depend a lot on the country and the way the labor market is set up, perhaps norms? I don't know. What is the experience from your work?
Thank you. Well, if I think about the work across the Asia Pacific, our average pay gap is 17.7%. But it ranges across the 21 countries in that APEC grouping from 9.2% to 31.2%. So it's really varied. And, you have a kind of a spread of wealth. You have a spread of population, and you also have a spread of formality and informality in the workforce. Certainly, I think all the drivers that have been kind of forementioned around kind of labor market institutions, so whether those countries have good collective bargaining or are well unionized, what are their sort of wage setting kind of legislative protocols, so where there are legislated minimum wages and job classification systems and kind of formal bargaining structures. And of course, we're going to see better wage equality. Care infrastructure, I could not express more how kind of critical and imperative that is around pay equality, because it's really the thing that is going to drive whether women are even in the workforce. And certainly we see much higher pay gaps in countries where there's informal care, a reliance on family care, and a lack of infrastructure, or really just very expensive care. So even in developed countries like Australia and New Zealand, where we have high levels of women's workforce participation, we do see kind of motherhood penalties around access to care, where our tax and transfer settings penalise a second earner, or the care itself is so expensive that families are making choices. But those choices are sort of in a vacuum because the alternative is, out of reach economically for them. And I do think, there's a lot of evidence, and the OECD has contributed to a lot of evidence around, well-paid, non-transferable, fathers' parental leave. I think that there's a lot of evidence that suggests in the countries that have invested in a really generous parental leave scheme, or that there is quarantined leave for men, that can contribute to a greater kind of share of care, and that then uplifts women's workforce participation, which of course contributes to greater kind of wage gap closure. I think what Australia has done really well, and certainly we are seeing it not just in other parts of the Asia Pacific, but I would say globally, is transparency, and really, more and more the transparency schemes around what the gender pay gap actually is, whether that's kind of broken down to industry and employer level. Around 2 years ago, Australia introduced employer level pay gap publications for any employer that had 100 or more employees, and that captured some 60% of the labour force. And so, any employee could go in and see at firm A, they've got a 22% pay gap, and in my competitive firm across the way in same industry, that pay gap is 8%. So, it created this competitive tension not just within industry, but also really created an energy around kind of radical transformation. And we saw employers, industries, and others really react strongly, and the media could understand, all of these complex factors boiled down into a single kind of metric, and we're really holding companies to account. And so I think I come back to, you want to have the structural settings right, but actually transparency to me is the greatest driver of rapid change. And that change is being then driven by companies themselves because they cannot afford to lose their employees, and the cost of losing their employees is so strong. And I think we will see already in the data from Australia that in the last couple of years, our pay gap has started to close even since the transparency has been in place, and certainly in the work across Asia Pacific, where there's greater transparency and where small and medium enterprises are supported to kind of understand how to close those pay gaps and how to measure them, then we're seeing those trends shift.
That's great. And the pay transparency, I think Monika has worked about it too. So we definitely should go back to that. But first, I want to bring in Cristina. Cristina, I think you worked a lot on parental leave, and Chantal just mentioned the quarantine leave. I think Spain experimented with that, but perhaps more generally, what does your research say about this? Is this a very promising measure? And I know others around the screen are also looking deeply into parental leave, so that's interesting.
Yes, thank you. It is. I think that paid parental leave is an incredible tool to go and to work with the elephant in the table, and it's like men are working less in unpaid work and actually in care work. So I think that is a measure that can transform that if it's designed in a particular way. In Spain, we have introduced equal and transferable fully paid parental leave, and in this parental leave is everything inclusive: maternity, paternity. I mean, like really all the paid leave are equally. But there is still a problem that is just the law encourage that most men use the parental leave at the same time that women, when evidence shows that the way to transform identities and what actually men do alone in the life cycle is to care alone. So it has some characteristics that are working quite well right now. Men use more or less the same days that women. Women use 112 days and men use 110 days out of the labor market to take care for their kids. But what happens is that when men and women are together taking care of their kids, women keeps maintaining the main role of the main career. So once the parental leave finish, mothers are at the same position, that they have to balance what to do. And as they are not universal education from 0 to 3, from 3 on, in Spain there's a universal childcare system. And so women kept in the same problem. So actually we know from international comparisons what kind of package would be a good one, like men and women having equal fully paid parental leave, and from the day that the parental leave is finished, it should be a universal access to childcare services. But we don't have that in any country, because for example in Sweden they have the access, but most women use most part of the parental leave, even if they have now 3 months for fathers, the daddy quotas. Mothers are kind of 1 year, 13 months out of the labor market. So that keeps the gender pay gap. So we don't have in any country a balance in which men and women are equally involved in unpaid care work. So I think that the paid parental leave should be a very, very relevant instrument, but it's very far away of the international regulations yet, because even in the Work-Life Balance Directive, it's expected to have 10 days for men for the paternity leave, while maternity leave is 14 weeks, and then the parental leave is non-transferable to months, but there's going to be 4 months. So the international regulations keeps a structure in which mothers are kept as the main caregiver. So it's very, very different to transform stereotypes and roles when the political structure care and keep their roles for mothers and for fathers. So that I think that is the very beginning of a very long gender pay gap, because it's at the time of the first kid when gender roles start in families and in the labor market. And in the interviews that we have done with human researchers, staff, and with fathers who have been using parental leave after the mother, society in Spain, and of course it's a minority all around the world, in which men take care as much as women and alone, like as main caregivers. So it's impossible to change a society if you don't change that as a social change. But I think that is a very, very useful tool if it's designed properly. And we have the evidence, we need to put it in place. I think so.
Thanks, Cristina. I think you, I had, sometimes you were interrupted. Is it just me? No, it's perhaps your connection. I don't know whether you can do anything about it, but we captured most of it. And perhaps that's the moment to bring in Monika and ask a little bit for the international comparison of these policies. So, some parental leave dedicated to the father. I know that was sort of successful in Germany, and first of all, lots of apprehension about it, and then it became very popular. But the time that fathers take is usually short, and as Cristina said, it's often used with the entire family, I think often for traveling. So policymakers are thinking about how to change this. But there was this interesting question about, Iga said men would like to be more involved with child care, but then even with the nudging exercises, I'm not so sure whether that it brings that result. What is the issue here, Monika? Can you give us some insights? And is it like Cristina says, that employers have to change also a little bit more in order for this to work?
Well, I think it's a whole host of different reasons that are come into play here. We at the OECD we've been working on family policy for many years. We have a family policy database which observes this. Our first series of analysis was in the early 2000s called Babies and Bosses, where we did country reviews to look at the reconciliation of work and family life. And at the time, it was still something that was kind of, it's not very important. And now that with population aging, everybody wants to have more women in the labor market working more hours, it's actually gotten to be a really important political priority for many countries, which is good news. Now, we see father's leave as the frontier in family policy. It is the most exciting area in recent years because, in the end, it's very difficult for governments to influence what goes on at home, and that's the way it should be. That governments shouldn't be determining how couples and families organize their lives, but there should be proper incentives for women not to be automatically those to take everything on. So that's that we see that the father's leave is a very effective instrument. You mentioned Germany, and it's quite spectacular how the use of father's leave, of course, fewer days and not as much as mothers, not as long as mothers, but Germany is a good example how it really changed the needle in the discussion. And the first country was Iceland, where we also saw that there was a huge uptake and very impressive. If you look at the charts, it's like it just goes through the roof of fathers taking leave. But then we are also saying what you were just saying, increasingly, please do not try to make it exclusive, because in order for change to happen, the fathers really do need to spend time with the children alone and take on these tasks, because then they're more likely to do it afterwards when everything is shared again, when the leave is over, So, but I have a question for Cristina, actually, because I heard that we work a lot on fertility. And in Spain, Spain is the only country that so far that has found a study on the effects of father's leave. I don't know if it was you, Cristina, or one of your colleagues who did this. And they found out that men were less likely to want a second child after they'd taken the leave and spend time with their children. And so Spain is the only country where we have seen this evidence. So Cristina, do you know anything about this study? And
yeah, Libertad and her team were the team that published that. But it was with that study, it was the paternity leave when the paternity leave of 2 weeks was started in Spain. and the size of it was, we were looking at the paternity leave, but it was correlated with a time that there was a strong crisis, economic crisis in Spain, all around the world, by the way. So I'm not so sure if it's I think that is a whole thing of package, and I don't think, for example, that the expansion to 16 weeks has decreased the fertility rate. I mean, it just I think that it was a study on that, but it was not kind of a robot replicable and like, okay, that is the cause of this. Exactly. So they found out, and of course, when we find any evidence in with the data, we try to publish it, but I don't think that is kind of a. I mean, the level of fertility in Spain is very low because actually there is not enough structure to support care at home, and I think that I used to remember when. Because part of the data that they use, it comes from the data that we created, so I know it quite well, and it's relevant to know what is possible. I remember when we analyzed the 2 weeks paternity leave, that it was like nothing. 2 weeks from, I mean, it's just 15 days, but actually it creates an effect. And it was at the same time that mothers, and we look at that effect. But what we can see is that this change how couples balance the care at home, but it doesn't change the structure of the economy and the society. However, now when you interview staff at human resources staff, they see that, okay, men and women are going to be out of the labor market more or less the same time. It's true that women still are a little bit longer than men, and then when there are issues, the mother keeps being, in general terms, the main caregiver. So I think that there is a difference, and when people say governments cannot enter in family life, well, actually, how is the paternity, maternity, and parental leave structure all around the world? It's an intervention of the government. So actually, these roles are not something that only comes from history and habit, but are still in our legislation. So changing that legislation is the way to do it. And when we say that if parental leave is equal, non-transferable, and fully paid, men are going to take it. The first comments that I've been receiving all the time is like, okay, for 2 weeks, yes, but that is not going to happen for 16 weeks. What we have seen in Spain, and it has been happen like the next day of the change of the law. I mean, because it was absolutely well paid. Because what we have seen in Europe, analyzing the labor force survey, is that men really want to take care for their kids, but if that act doesn't increase their financial losses, they can care if they don't lose money. So and that makes sense, and I think most women are in the same situation. Most women cannot deal with losing money because actually wages are not so high in many countries. So even, for example, in Spain, but in other countries too, working part-time, the main cause to working part-time is not for caring, but because they don't found a full-time job. So actually the narrative of, okay, women are out of the labor market because they decide to care is not always true. But it keeps being the narrative, and I think that that's important. So I think that paternity leave and fully paid parental leave that are equal for men and women can actually change the roots of an economy, because we have 24 hours a day. So women are out of the labor market because they are working, we are working, but we are not being paid for care work. So I think that is basically the cause, and men need to work more, like with childcare and long-term care, and we need more public services for care, like childcare and long-term care service. And these two pillars are basic, so women can work in an equal conditions, I think.
Perfect. Well, that's very interesting, Cristina, to reflect upon what policy interventions do to roles on the labor market and at home. Perhaps, Lina, because you're looking at this from a European perspective, can you talk briefly about different, let's say, policy interventions, experiments, and what you can say about, I don't know, do you have insights into what it does? Well, labor market is what we usually look into, but Monika just mentioned fertility decisions, much more difficult to show causation, of course, but perhaps there's research in other European countries on this.
Yes, thank you. These are difficult questions. But to start with policies, perhaps, I think we have lots of good policies per se. What is really lacking and what we see is implementation of them, proper implementation, especially at the institutional level already, and coordination of policies. So just to give a couple of examples, let's think about parental leave as something that is visible in the public, because we talk about the role models, which is very important for gender equality, but we know parental leave is not available to many important groups in the, let's say, labor market. Typically, it's for employees. We will not have it for judges. We will not have it or restricted access to in academia, higher roles, parliamentarians, you name other, positions that have a massive visibility, that have a massive role in terms of shaping gender stereotypes, but these are not associated with equal care distribution. And typically in these higher positions, we have more men still than women. And the reason is also very often because it's impossible to combine work and life balance in these kind of positions. The other example would be, let's take, we have a parental leave directive, at work-life balance directive. And at the same time, we know that many countries are still lacking implementation, proper implementation of these directives. So very often we would say, yes, a person has a right to parental leave, but how is it implemented in practice? Can they access it really? And we talked then about institutional barriers actually to access it. So one could be stigma. The other one, let's say, again, lots of research from academic settings is you would need to find your own replacement. So is this the way forward to implement the parental leave, right? No, it's not. It's actually producing further and further stereotypes when on the one side we say, okay, it's there. On the other side, we know there are lots of barriers to actually implement it. And the other thing perhaps about coordination of policies, we talk on the one side about a very big goal of increasing female employment. On the other side, we have educational settings that take care of, let's say, child's well-being and educational achievements. The two systems are often, we know, not coordinated. So on the one side, we want to have more working hours, higher participation of women. At the same time, the same women, mothers, are expected to deal with very employment, not social hours. So let's say late in the morning, very early closure of the schools, etc., that are not compatible with full-time employment. And that actually reflects further on into the same stereotypes that we saw on the graph of aspirations. We tell the girls, yes, you need to look for aspirations in STEM careers to become engineers. But what do they see in reality? They see them, mothers, picking them up from school because it is at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, taking them home maybe for lunchtime. These are still more of the mothers. So there is lots of what we want to have and what is there, but coordination of the settings is not yet properly done. And that actually translates in lots of loss of employment and talents on the women's side. Because yes, I want to be an engineer, but when I see that most of women around are still choosing for the care professions or teaching professions because it's supposed to be more compatible with my forthcoming care duties, I choose that pathway. And this is, we actually have done research about gender segregation across the EU. Even for those, let's say, women, girls who choose STEM careers, what happens later on in the labor market, they stay in the STEM field, but they go to teach in the schools because that is, again, more compatible. The public institutions would be seen as more compatible to balance work and life. So there are lots of these pathways that are actually, we have good settings. I'm not saying that. We have good settings, but we are missing is proper implementation. What we're missing is also translation of gender equality goals into wider policy settings and a good coordination between different actors. So that would be about the policies, about fertility. I think it's a major thing. And one argument that I think we should really stop buying is that fertility cannot be influenced and that it's set in stone. As we see through the decades, it was changing a lot. And we also see that across countries, it is changed. The same are with stereotypes. They are not set in stones. They're changing. And one thing is when you would look into, for example, the average number of children that women that work in, let's say, women-friendly occupations, so work-life balance, friendly occupations, let's say care, education, etc., and the number of children that women have when they work in the STEM sector, it's a massive difference. So there in STEM sector, women do not have that many children if they work compared into the care or educational settings. And why is that? The major reason is actually organizational cultures. The full-time work, the high demand, and you are put into a position where you cannot imagine that you can still have a child with long working hours and the demand there. So we have the organizational settings and the way we go about the working time that actually is a major factor in fertility decisions of both women and men in partnerships. If you have chosen a career in STEM, most likely, and if you are in gender equitable couple, most likely the man will support that you pursue your career. So you'll go for one child rather than two. And we have lots of these fertility decisions that are actually not being discussed or discussed within the couples. But the household decisions, they are completely taken out of the labor market. And I think they should be placed much more explicitly on the agenda if we want to go forward. And to make the life, to make the working life and the private life better for all.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lina. Yeah, Iga, that circles a little bit back to what you said about women entering STEM fields and still negotiating perhaps lower wages. There I had the question when I listened to Chantal, and we have to ask Chantal about it too. Does pay transparency work? Does it help you to negotiate better? I know that, there's a lot of research about these women negotiating, right? And in fact, if you negotiate more aggressively, it doesn't help you as a woman because you're viewed differently than a man who negotiated strongly. The man is seen as competent, you're seen as not likable, etc. So there's a big challenge here. But then also perhaps the flexibility of working hours in STEM. What I was thinking, and I'm going to ask you to the second question, Iga, is when some ways with home office, true, it demands a lot of hours, but can there be more flexibility in STEM fields now going forward? Could it be friendlier to combining care of children and, by the way, also the elderly and this job? How do you see the prospects? How is that evolving in Poland and other countries you look at?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, that's a very good question, whether pay transparency can really help. On the one hand, that's what you expect, because if you have the wages that are there on the table, then it's much easier to negotiate the same amount of salary for men and women. But at the same time, in another research on academia, which is a very regulated workplace and has pay transparency, at least theoretically, it does show that there is no such thing as pay equality, and actually you observe kind of pay equality like 3-4%, but it should be 0, right? So it's like you observe a pay gap, a small pay gap if you look at just the basic wages, but if you look at all the other kind of contracts that we can have in academia and additions and benefits, etc., it turns out that the gap is again 10-12%. So it's disappointing, and I would think so. Yeah, so there is something I wanted to mention. Poland is working on implementing the Pay Transparency Directive, and the first law enters into force on the Christmas Eve. Actually, it will be about showing the exact salary offered in the job advert. So we'll see how it works. But actually, at the same time, the ministry has launched last week actually the tool to evaluate jobs, right? So this is what you were, Monika, mentioning. I will be looking into that in the coming days. So if you have, if you could share perhaps just some pieces of the work that you said was done, that would really help to try to improve perhaps or adjust the tool that we have for Poland. So coming back to the STEM question, it looked really, I mean, there is more research to be done there because there's at the same time, if you look at the STEM subjects, there is a huge gap between, for example, mathematics, and very quickly men start earning more than 30% than women, and like earth sciences, where there is a gap of 2%, so basically in existing. So, and I can't really explain where it does come from. We think that men who graduate from mathematics, they end up in banks. And that's something that in the financial sector, and women, even if also they are in the financial sector, they are just again in the lower positions, earning less. So that's again not really very positive picture here.
Thanks, Iga. And Chantal, perhaps you can, because this pay transparency is well implemented in some countries, and I think Monika will be able to tell us more. Successful in some, not so much in others. In Germany, there's a big debate about, well, is that, you sort of, shouldn't it be, well, I don't know whether it's actually at the, you said there's data at the firm level, but probably not at the individual level. I don't know. But whether it sort of takes away your task to negotiate for yourself or the ability for the employer to evaluate what you're going to contribute. Can you really measure all those differences? But you said it worked well in Australia, and perhaps you can say a little bit more how it's set up and how come it does work so well.
I think part of the success so far of the kind of expanded pay transparency program in Australia is that it came about through a really rich and broad industry consultation. So the government worked with industry around the existing regime of pay kind of transparency that existed for some 10 years before that, and really kind of negotiated what some of those kind of red tape kind of challenges were, and where there was a real kind of opportunity to kind of create efficiencies for business. And the trade-off was that then additional data would be collected, but that the net benefit for industry was that actually it would become a far less onerous regime of reporting. And so I think it didn't struggle in terms of gaining kind of broad industrial support to make the changes. And I think that was a politically savvy kind of way to kind of work with it, because it allowed not just new reporting requirements to be loaded in, but actually a kind of cleanup of what had worked and not worked across that scheme for 10 years. And I think that meant that you didn't come up against that same political tension that might have otherwise existed across the economy, where people would have said that this is government imposing a kind of stricter body of kind of reporting requirements upon them, and that's going to have an impact on their profitability. The other thing I think that made it really successful is there was a 1-year gap between the legislation coming in and the first publication of data. So it actually enabled industry a full year to kind of get their houses in order, to receive their results privately, and then kind of have a year to kind of consider what might they want to kind of enact to close those gaps or to improve their standing before that data became transparent. And so there was a good faith attempt to kind of support industry, and there was certainly a big investment from the government around the capacity of our workplace gender equality agency to be providing direct support to industry bodies or particularly large employers, and to kind of give them that kind of almost one-on-one kind of guidance as they needed it. The other thing I think was pretty critical to the design was that the transparency is not the only thing. What is required in that mechanism is also a body of work around action planning, and being supported to understand, what works, what targets they may want to set for themselves, and then, the steps that they need to take to drive that change, and what is effective in terms of, affecting their gender segregation, closing their pay gaps. The data that is reported to companies breaks it down to the quartiles across their employment base. So they can really see the pay gaps at very senior levels all the way through to kind of the lower lower working levels. And so they can see if they've got a concentration of a problem, and they get an analysis that is company specific, and the law requires the board to consider that analysis and to share that back with employees. So it actually also generates a broader discussion within companies who are reporting around what that data is saying, why that data exists. And, for some industries where there is high segregation, like mining, like the STEM sort of industries, it means that the kind of targets they might set for themselves when they think about, labour supply chains might be very different to what, industries like retail or hospitality might set for themselves. The other thing I think was really effective about it was the public transparency that I spoke about before, because I think your points about backlash and, kind of the different reality women face negotiating in the workplace versus men is really true. But what this process illuminated, particularly for some major employers in Australia, particularly in the financial services industry, was that the pay gaps were exorbitant. And so women might have thought they were making a trade-off for flexibility, for kind of bigger leave provisions because of their care requirements, and that they might think that that was reasonable compared to their male colleagues. But actually the lack of transparency that predated that, and the requirement for non-disclosure agreements or kind of gag clauses, meant that actually those gaps were far wider than anyone really knew or believed them to be. And so there was quite a level of industry and employer level ricochet when that data first became transparent. And I think that en masse it did return power to individuals, not just women, but individuals. And certainly I think, with unions and with media and with other kind of galvanizing bodies, it's meant that, people have been supported to navigate how to flex that data in ways that have kind of driven change. And so I think what we're seeing in Asia Pacific is a kind of lighter version of what are those things that actually make it work. And I think what really makes it work is supporting employers, because there are genuine, commitments to equality and egalitarianism, and sometimes through the compound effect of kind of leave for care and kind of that kind of segregation, vertical and horizontal, those gaps compound in ways that even employers and boards would find themselves surprised about. And so I think actually equipping them to undertake audits, to look at their pay gaps, to know what targets to set for themselves and the steps to take, I think is effective. And certainly there hasn't been the sort of same sort of structural backlash on women en masse that we hear about in other places. But I think Australia is unique in that we have a very low informal labour force, whereas in countries and communities where there's a high informality, then, it's a completely different story.
Sure. But that's, Monika, what Chantal said, I found interesting. I remember we discussed it around I think the Swiss payment pay transparency initiative. So this idea that it's also assisting employers in some way, because many of the discriminations that we perhaps see can be subconscious or unconscious. So sometimes it's just good to see what's actually happening. I saw, by the way, quite a horrible piece of research by Lena Hipp recently, that she looked into the effect of women leaning in Germany. So so most women will take a year or so, 10 months after childbirth. But if they do come earlier because they think, oh, maybe then I have a shorter gap, what actually happens is that they're invited less to job interviews. And for men, interestingly, it doesn't make a difference. So if they take longer leaves, it's not negative. But for women, who somehow seem to be judged for the combined image role of a worker and a parent. So Monika, just on that, so what has pay transparency initiatives, what have they achieved? And would you agree with Chantal that it's a lot about also raising awareness among employers and the wider public? And
Yeah. So I think very briefly, because it's, I mean, I put some resources in there. Of course, it's a huge field, and countries are doing it in different ways. And you could talk about sanctions, for example. Is it important to have sanctions or not? You can see the example of the UK, which have only started with big companies, but it was very effective in the sense that I remember the Big Four coming up saying, "Oh, we have no pay gaps." And then there was an outcry across the UK saying, no, but this can't be true. And then they say, oops, we took a closer look, and actually we do have to say we do have pay gaps. And this is just through public awareness, yeah? So that's an interesting story. So we have put this together at the OECD. So I would say there's 3 things that pay transparency can do, and that is to hold employers accountable, to give workers and their representatives tools to fight individual or systemic pay inequality, and to raise stakeholder awareness of the presence, causes, and consequences of gender wage gaps. So even just keeping gender wage gaps, gender pay gaps in the conversation. What it can't do is that, and these are criticisms still we have to work on, the onus of identifying, raising, and rectifying pay inequality still largely rests on individual workers. So, I mean, it's still you having to go to your employer and kind of say, I'm not happy about this, and what can we do? And that's a pretty high burden, particularly if you don't have a relationship of power, you know, if you're scared to raise these issues. And as you were just saying, there's plenty of research also that says that you get sanctioned for doing this. So then transparency cannot guarantee that women's wage gains are not compensated for elsewhere, for example, in lower men's wages, which is also something that we've been observing. Of course, we want women's wages to go up and not the gap to be reduced because men's wages are falling. And then finally, and we've talked a lot about this in the seminar already, pay transparency cannot correct the choices and constraints accumulated over the life course. Again, you know, so it's many factors. But I would just like to pick up one more thing, which is a current discussion that I'm hearing a lot, and it puts gender pay gap discussions in the same space as, say, environmental or supply chain reporting. There's a big push for debureaucratization and simplification, very much in the European Union, but also elsewhere in the world, which is a good thing because we shouldn't be burdening companies, particularly smaller, medium-sized enterprises, with too much reporting requirements, and it can be quite expensive and difficult to do so. At the same time, if we throw all of these reporting requirements out now, then we don't measure anymore, and we lose all of the success that we've achieved up until now. So I think that's a point that's really important to me, where we have to be careful that we, on the key causes, that we don't lose transparency, because we all know what happens if you don't measure it, then it just doesn't exist anymore at some point. Yeah. And also, I want to say, just for the resource, and I think my colleague Valentina Patrini can put it in the chat. We do have the Equal Pay International Coalition, and we take new members all the time. So take a look at what it takes to become a member with your company or with your organization, and do follow this joint initiative of the OECD, the ILO, and UN Women, which has plenty of very practical resources on pay transparency. You mentioned the Swiss, but also interesting things from New Zealand, from other countries, and you can look at the different models that are being applied. There you go. You have it in the, Valentina just put it in.
Yeah, Cristina, we're coming almost to the end of our time, but I want to, I still have a few questions. In Spain, perhaps you can tell me whether there's a pay transparency initiative and how it works, but perhaps more widely, these things, how labor market institutions and policies and then norms interact. So you said, well, policies, if there's the right setup overall, they can change things. But I know there's also research that showing that as more women move into the sectors, because some people say, well, why do they choose the sectors that are low pay? In part, Lina answered this. It's often because they're more compatible with the unpaid care work. But also there's research showing that as more women move into the sector, actually wages tend to not go down, but grow less, even for the men. So what can be done about that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that it was very interesting, the graphic on the correlation between if a sector is women dominated, actually conditions are worse. And I think that that's why I think that it's really, really relevant that more men enter into long-term care and care in a wider sense. And I think that, again, sorry for coming back to parental leave, but I found very interesting a new article that says that the kids, especially the boys that have been cared by their fathers alone, tend to be more in female-dominated sectors, like more care sectors in the long term. Like this has been done with countries like Sweden, like Iceland. Like they have kids, like now they are 20 something, so they are entering the labor market. So actually there is an issue about how we value care. And I think that relates to with the working time, what Lina was saying about the coordination. We need that the full-time working time is reduced so it's compatible. So mothers or carers don't have to reduce their working time, so everybody can work full time and at the same time take care of their responsibilities. So I think that is very, very relevant, the paid transparency, because actually we need to know. Why I totally agree. What we is not measured, it doesn't exist. So we need it. And I think that the directive is very useful for that. In Spain, we still have a lot to do on that, but it is starting to happen. But these are usually the big companies, and Spain is a country with a lot of small and medium-sized companies. So it's something that is happening, but very little by little. And the big part of the pay gap is not in the salary, in the base salary, but in the complements, for different parts. And that is much more difficult to measure because are not into this. No, I thought that what Chantel said about working with the companies is very needed, and it's something that it lacks because they don't see it as something that is going to help them, but it's something that is kind of a bureaucratic thing that they need to do, exactly like the gender equality plan, and so they don't take it as a instrument, as a tool to improve and to create more efficiency and more retention of the talent, but as a bureaucratic something that they have to do. And I think that we need to advance a lot in that term. But I think that transparency is absolutely needed. But if we don't change the basics, things are not going to improve. We need more men being in the paid and unpaid care work because that's the way to like if everybody is in that sector, everybody's going to value it. And what I've seen is that when fathers are taking care of their kids alone, they value it more, and then when they come back to the labor market, work-life balance measures are more extended in their teams. They appreciate it more. They finish on time and go to pick up their kids at the school. So I mean, you can see, for example, some changes in Spain. Even if you don't see a big change in the labor market, you can see some difference in what actually men and women do and expect from each other. So it will take time, but I think that if the structures, the political measures are well done and well designed, in the long term, they will change economic and social measures. But we need that the design is good, and we are very far aware of good standard measures at international and national level, I think.
Great. And we just have a comment in the in the chat, which is very true, and we observed that too. So we're only women on the panel here, and also in the audience, many women. So it's a conversation, this thing that men would benefit a lot from more unpaid work. We have to have that conversation with men. Having said that, there are male researchers in the field. Lina has colleagues, and he couldn't make it because too many demands today. But you're quite right, Lilian. Lina, perhaps one last question about this. When we say, or Cristina says, we need more men also in unpaid work. She's very right when she says, well, somehow the organization of work has to change. And of course, there's this great research by Claudia Goldin that shows, well, women can go quite far in in jobs that have been reorganized, that perhaps were demanding lots of hours some 50 years ago, somehow organized differently. Pharmacy, I think, was one of her example. And then you can have a leadership position and still make time for other duties. So is that something, can it be done politically? Or Cristina is nodding, but Lina, perhaps just from your research, from your policy work, do you think we're going to get there?
I think so. I am quite optimistic on that still. I think things are changing still, and we see across generations when we look into different statistics, there is progress. We're moving, and of course, the major challenge is that the progress is not stopped, and that especially among young generations, we do not have increasing gaps. But overall, we do see progress. And I will just quote a few statistics. We collect CARE survey at our agency. And actually, it shows that 42% of men and 33% of men still believe that fathers should work and mothers should stay at home when childcare services are not available. And this is something that it's one of the stereotypes that is driving, of course, the equal pay, the participation in the labor market. And it very much relates to the intensity of unpaid care. It's not about 2 or 3 hours per week. Both women and men, and we have data, they do it. Long-term care, childcare, men and women are engaged on both sides. What matters is intensity of care. So when it comes to 20 hours per week, so who takes, the bulk of the childcare, for example, duties for the small children? That's what matters for labor market participation. And still we have some good news. We looked recently into the Eurobarometer on the gender stereotypes, and it says that overall in the EU, 80% of women and 75% of men think it's good for the economy if women and men receive equal pay and participate equally in the labor market. So at the macro level, we have the good news. The bad news are still at the household level and the distribution of tasks between the partners. And one of the reasons this year we updated the Gender Equality Index, and if you take a look into it, one of the indicators we're bringing much more into the highlight is actually the share of earnings between the partners. So in the couples, because actually that's where inequalities start. So if you have couples with children, this is where inequalities are the biggest, because actually for men, if you will look into the full-time equivalent employment rates, being in couple with children is the boost for career. For women, it's the opposite. So families are set so to enable men's employment, so to support the men's careers. And I think we should be also moving more with visibility, with implementation of the rules that are set there, so that women also have the same chances. And one last thing for me is we haven't talked so much today, but it's very closely related to the labor market. And as often we hear choices and, willingness to participate. And so we have to not forget a bit of grave reality still that we have related to gender norms and stereotypes is economic violence. About 3% of women in the EU are still forbidden to work. So no chances of employment. It's not about choices. It's not about, they are forbidden by their intimate partners. So you are my partner, you're my wife, you are not working. And if we would explain, we saw it also in this survey that we collected together with FRA, if we would explain a bit better of what economic violence means. So to say, for example, it's about interfering with employment, educational choices. So for example, number of hours, where you work, how you do things, about building debt without knowledge of the partner, you would see that this number is skyrocketing. It goes to up to 20% of economic violence. And that has a lot to do for gender pay inequalities, for economic empowerment through lifetime of women. And I think that's something that we still have to talk more about when we talk about the employment opportunities. So thank you.
Thanks for that point. And we are really past our time, but because we were talking now about norms in Europe, I just want to briefly bring you in, Chantal, because you're looking at Asia Pacific, and perhaps you can just give us some insights. Does it differ a lot across countries there, depending on, you were talking about whether there's informality or formality, and this perhaps, if you have a word on it, economic violence, does it get harsher when the country has more poverty and more informality? Is that something you've looked into?
think yes, and I think what actually harms is when the structural protections aren't in place. So when there aren't laws that enable women to own, to have their own bank account, or to own property, or to engage in the labour force without permission. And so there are regressive kind of conduct across the regions in different parts where you would think in across Asia Pacific that it would be completely reasonable and legal for a woman to have a bank account in her own name. But in fact, there are a number of economies where she will need permission, or that bank account will need to be in a man's name. And so I think part of the opportunity in the Asia Pacific is looking at structural reforms that kind of go to equalizing women's rights, ensuring there's anti-discrimination law, that there is actually a right to participate in the economy, a right to have access to education. And so I think particularly in developing economies, we are still starting there. The conversation is still, in that kind of structural level. I do think in terms of norm setting, women's kind of access to education over the last 50 years and how they far exceed men in terms of completion rates of university, and their outcomes are much higher in terms of quality of results in many instances, has done a lot to normalise women's labour force participation. But I do think that, there are deeply rooted, very challenging kind of cultural, normative and traditional practices around men and women's gender roles, particularly when it comes to parenting, that a lot of governments and policies, as well as corporate and employer practices, constantly reinforce. And they may not do that in a sense that it's deliberately designed, but it may be quite subtle. And so, there are examples where tax laws, disincentivize the mother from returning to work for more than a small number of days. And so that sort of secondary earner or primary parent, secondary parent model that is hard-coded into a lot of the economic modelling is reinforcing a lot of those norms in ways that if we change the policy and change the economic levers, we'd actually potentially see the norms shift. And so I do think we get the gender gap that we design for, and a lot of that policy was designed and developed when there was a male breadwinner, one income earner in a family, very normative, kind of gender parenting roles that have not really kept up with women's advancement in education and participation into the labour force, and the cost of living pressures that now demand dual income households in ways that did not exist in developed economies 50 or 60 years ago. One thing we have not talked about explicitly, but we have touched on slightly, that I have become incredibly kind of hot on this year, and it's about how do we transform the parental distribution of care beyond paid parental leave incentives, which I think for many governments is a really challenging prospect when they are facing large deficits to kind of uplift their investment in welfare state. Is actually around work hours. And I think we did hear a little bit about transforming the workplace, but all of the kind of evidence that exists, and it is small and nascent, around shortened work week, so not compressed hours, but actually going to a 4-day work week. It is such a powerful structural lever for redistributing that unpaid care. And I think there's been a pilot and evaluation in the UK where there was a 27% uplift in men's unpaid care and women's by 13%. We saw similar figures in Australia and New Zealand. To me, it's about normalising that everyone should care. And I think, to the point made earlier, paid parental leave is really great at getting dads to activate and to participate in that first year of life. But you just go back to work with the same set of expectations and demands. And so for me, I think, there's something really novel and interesting about pursuing, genuine transformation of the labour force, kind of workplace standards around shortened work weeks that don't have productivity impacts. And in fact, some of those trials show increased productivity and certainly much more retention, reduced burnout, and kind of higher job satisfaction that I think we should invest more time reflecting upon, because it gets to the point that Claudia Golden was making about greedy jobs, and it absolutely will unpick those norms in my view.
That's great. And I think that's a great ending to our super interesting discussion. Thank you, Iga, Monika, Cristina, Chantal, and Lina. There was one man actually in the in the chat, at least. And it shows that there's much more to work on. So we shall meet again. But for now, I'll just leave you with all the good food for thought. I think some people in the audience have enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a good day, and make sure you negotiate well both your pay and the time you invest in in the unpaid work.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.